The year is 1984, and the auto industry is finally starting to come out of the doldrums from the 1980, 1981 model years, which were arguably the nadir of the U.S. automotive industry. At this point, Pontiac is introducing its We Build Excitement campaign and is looking to place a car in the marketplace that's small and sporty and can really be fun for drivers as well as efficient. It sounds like everything rolled up into one. It's efficient, it's sporty, it returns good fuel economy. Well, that's kind of what the goal was for the 1984 2000 Sunbird Turbo. As you can see, this advertisement had it named. Now, in truth, the 2000 Sunbird Turbo was based on the J2000, which was Pontiac's version of the J car, the Chevrolet Cavalier, as well as the Oldsmobile Forenza, the Buick Skyhawk, and the Cadillac Cimarron. But Pontiac was really the one that was leaning into performance during this time, as well as, candidly, Buick. Really strange. But yes, there was also a Skyhawk Turbo that would be introduced. But the 2000 Sunbird Turbo was really quite an advanced car for the time frame. So we're going to describe it a little more and take a look at a car that I saw recently at the Pontiac Oakland Club's 100-year anniversary show. Now, at the heart of the 2000 Sunbird Turbo sat one of General Motors' most unusual and actually quite advanced engines. It displays just 1.8 liters, but the 1.8-liter four-cylinder that was under hood was an overhead cam engine that actually traced its roots to GM Brazil's operations, where overhead cam engines had become commonplace long before most American manufacturers embraced the design within the domestic markets. And the overhead camshafts enabled the engine to rev a bit more freely. And actually, this was an engine that Pontiac employed in its J cars, and other divisions would use it as well, except for Chevrolet, in a 1.8-liter configuration that in standard form, without the turbocharger, made around 85 horsepower. Now, the 1.8-liter engine that was under hood in the 2000 by this point, as I mentioned, was sourced from GM Brazil. When the J cars were introduced in 1982, they had a 1.8-liter overhead valve engine, totally different engine, just for that one model year only. And it was so lacking in power that it lasted just that one model year before it was enlarged to 2 liters and would never go back. That was the Chevrolet-sourced overhead valve four-cylinder. So just to make the distinction, this 1.8-liter engine that's overhead cam is completely different than the 1.8-liter overhead valve engine that was the engine in all the J cars in the inaugural 1982 model year. Now, what's amazing about the 2000 Sunbird Turbo is that it took that 1.8-liter engine that made just around 85 horsepower, and it converted it into an engine that made 83 horsepower per liter, a total of 150 horsepower from 1.8 liters using a Garrett turbocharger. Now, that's pretty remarkable for the time to get 150 horsepower out of 1.8 liters. And it really was something that was perhaps one of General Motors' most sophisticated engines. In fact, it probably even felt like aerospace technology back in 1984. Turbochargers weren't all that common. Of course, they have been around on domestic cars. General Motors actually introduced them to the general public on mass market vehicles with the Corvair Monza, as well as the Oldsmobile Jetfire in 1962. But that had been long since forgotten, and here turbochargers were really starting to make a comeback, probably led by Buick with its turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 engines, and Pontiac maybe got a little jealous of Buick and their turbocharging and decided they wanted to do something of their own. Now, the Garrett turbocharger was such that in this 1.8-liter engine, it was designed to minimize turbo lag, but I will just say, having driven one of these cars, that minimizing turbo lag back then is very different than today. Today, most turbochargers, particularly the twin turbocharged vehicles, have almost no turbo lag. Well, this one had relatively small turbo lag. It was, I would say it's still high for the modern time frame. Now, road testers, when they drove the 2000 Sunbird Turbo, really kind of sung a number of its praises. And Motor Trend, as an example, noted that the turbocharger, once it entered its operating range, the Pontiac accelerated with an enthusiasm that felt entirely different from conventional domestic four-cylinder engines. But rather than delivering perfectly linear power, the engine rewarded drivers who kept it in the heart of its boost curve. So to modern drivers who are accustomed to these very sophisticated turbochargers, electronic boost management, etc., the experience, I would say, of this engine would feel rather abrupt. But in 1984, it felt exciting and unconventional in a good way, and it really gave the car personality. Not only had the turbocharger, but it also employed multi-port fuel injection. So unlike, as an example, Pontiac's 301 cubic inch V8 that was turbocharged in the 1980 and 1981 model years in the Firebird, here you have a relatively sophisticated multi-port fuel injection system instead of a carburetor, making sure that the turbocharger can really maximize, or the engine can really maximize all of the turbocharger has to offer. And I have to say it was certainly successful in its mission from that perspective. Interestingly, while you could get a 5-speed manual as standard equipment in the base 2000, at this point, you could not get that with the optional 1.8-liter turbocharged engine. You had to settle for a 4-speed manual transmission or the 3-speed automatic. My guess is that the 5-speed manual just couldn't take the torque of the turbocharged engine. But even when equipped with a 4-speed manual, this little turbocharged 2000 Sunbird Turbo could rocket to 60 miles an hour in just under 8 seconds. And though that doesn't sound fast for today's time frame, that really is a little pocket rocket by 1984 standards. It would certainly out-accelerate a standard Trans Am, as an example, with 145 horsepower, 5-liter, 305 cubic inch V8. And beyond that, when you ordered the turbo engine, you also got standard the WS6 suspension package, which was actually the same name for the sportier performance suspension on the Pontiac Firebird and Trans Am, and gave you stiffer struts up front, a bigger roll bar, and really helped improve the car's handling. So overall, it was actually quite a sophisticated package for this little 2000 Sunbird, as it was called at this particular point in time. And of course, there were a number of competitors, but really not all that many. The Volkswagen GTI was probably the most comparable competitor. And at this particular point in time, I would say the GTI was one that, well, probably was a bit more of a driver's car. The rack and pinion setup in that car was, I would say, far better than what GM was using in terms of road feel. But really, while the GTI, you could feel the texture of the road, the Pontiac really isolated a number of those sensations. And I think that wasn't necessarily a flaw in Pontiac engineering. That was just because they believed that Americans preferred a lighter steering effort and a more isolated experience. But of course, the Buff books didn't like that, and Car and Driver in particular observed that while the turbocharged engine genuinely challenged European rivals in straight-line performance, the 2000 Sunbird Turbo's chassis still lacked the delicacy and precision that was exhibited by Volkswagen's benchmark GTI. Of course, there was the Honda Prelude as well, and that did not have a turbocharged engine, just had a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder, and anybody who's driven a Honda 4-cylinder of the 1980s knows just how sweet they are. So while it didn't have a turbo, it certainly had a beautiful sewing machine-like just feel to it, and everything in that Prelude. That is a real gem of a car to drive, except you kind of breathe on them and they rust. So that's the one downside to the Honda Preludes of the era. Not really cars that I would say would be great to continue driving in the winter. And of course, who could forget the Dodge Omni GLH, or Goes Like Hell, that was introduced in 1984. It also was not a turbocharged car. It had a 2.2-liter 4-cylinder, 110 horsepower. I think it was a bit more crude than the Sunbird or the 2000 Sunbird Turbo, in part because the car, the Omni, was pretty old by this point in time, and the J cars were still relatively new. Now, when it comes to the styling of the Pontiac 2000 Sunbird Turbo, boy, that is a mouthful, and no wonder why Pontiac would drop the 2000 after the 1984 model year. By the way, I shall say that Pontiac was actually going to, at one point, name all of its vehicles with numbers, like the Pontiac 6000, you had the J2000, you had the T1000. I think the Fiero was going to be the 3000. I want to say the Firebird, maybe the 4000, the Bonneville, the 8000, and then they scrapped the nomenclature. I suspect that Pontiac changed general managers somewhere along the way, and somebody thought, well, that's just kind of silly. We have all this brand equity in the names of the vehicles, and we're not going to be Audi, or somebody else. So let's just get rid of the numeric scheme. But Pontiac was actually going to go to all numbers for their models in the 1980s. In any case, the styling of the J cars, whether it's the Pontiac, the Chevrolet, the Olds, the Buick, the Cadillac, all kind of look similar, and they do share backlights and roof panels and door uppers and A-pillars, windshields. But there is quite a bit of unique sheet metal on these, amazingly. The quarter panels are different. You'll notice the tail lamps are different. The cutouts for the tail lamps are different across them, which drives a different quarter panel. The deck lids are different for the same reason. So despite the fact that they all look kind of similar, they're really not. They have quite a bit of unique sheet metal. So I don't want my GM designer friends telling me that the finance people didn't give them the money for doing something different, because we did. We gave them money, and then they decided to make all the cars look alike, basically. That's not really fair, but that's okay. I'm doing this video. In any case, you have a pretty clean style to these cars overall. I think they're handsome in appearance. They have good trunk volume. You'll notice that the trunk, the deck lid, doesn't really taper. It continues to be a uniform height all the way to the rear of the car and then kind of chops off a bit abruptly. Well, that allows for quite a bit of trunk volume on these cars. So, you can actually fit quite a bit of items in the trunk. The back seats really aren't that generous from a roominess standpoint, but these cars are small. When you get in them, you're kind of amazed by how small they are relative to modern cars. And they have a nice, feel to them when you're driving them. They're not perfect. They're not a European expensive sedan. But I have to say the J cars that I've driven actually, in general, drive pretty well for their price class. Now, there is a little bit of European flair in these J cars. That Hofmeister kink C-pillar that emulates BMWs doesn't look bad on these cars. It's a little bit humorous, but that's where that trait came from. Lots of glass. Notice how low the belt line is, how much door glass there is, how big the backlight is, the windshield. So despite the fact these cars are small, one thing that GM really did well is they have an open and airy feel. And they don't look as small on the outside as they really are. There's some designer tricks like that full-width tail lamp panel on the Pontiacs with the smoked glass tail lights. Boy, I missed the smoked glass tail lights. I thought that looked cool. And Pontiac had that for a number of years across quite a few different vehicles. Grand Prix, 6000s, Fieros. It's too bad that went by the wayside, I guess, along with Pontiac. But oh well. And then up front, we have, I would say, a decent-looking front end with the Pontiac split grille. It's actually not really the grille in this case. It's the split headlamps. But I think it's an attractive-looking front end. Very flat belt line on these, low belt line. Notice how it kind of skives downward from the A-pillar to give you that big glass area like I was talking about, giving these cars that open and airy feel. Relatively thin B-pillars, relatively thin A-pillars. I don't know that I want to be in a crash with these. They certainly weren't engineered to modern-day crash standards. But at least you had good visibility, so there was less likelihood of you getting in a crash in the first place because you could actually see out of the car and didn't need some huge blind spot monitoring system. And here's the interior of this 8,000-mile original 84 2000 Sunbird Turbo. And you got nice bucket seats, kind of covered in vinyl, not anything to write home about. They did have optional sportier seats. This car does have the optional 3-speed automatic transmission. You did get the 3-spoke wheel that says Turbo FI on the horn pad. and a full complement of gauges, which are admittedly hard to see in the picture, but by this point, Pontiac was illuminating them in their signature orange lighting as opposed to another color. So Pontiac did introduce that orange that would stick around for many years after that, really until the brand was sunset. And I thought that was a nice differentiator. I thought that the orange lighting was rather nice at night. There was even a little turbo boost gauge that you could have. And if you look here on the passenger side, you'll see that the IP is really pushed forward. There's not much distance from the windshield to the edge of the IP that's closest to the passenger seat to give that passenger the sense of roominess. And then there's that driver-centric binnacle that's pulled backward to allow some of the controls to be pulled backward. And the driver's sitting behind the steering wheel anyway, so you're not going to necessarily need that full sense of openness, but the passenger gets that from sitting in his or her seat. I will say on the J cars, because they are so small, the one thing that does bug me a little bit is the wheel well intrusion into the passenger compartment. Doesn't really seem to affect me on the driver's side. The dead pedal for your left foot is okay, but it just feels weird on the passenger side when you really can't put your right foot necessarily where you want to. Your left foot has enough room, but oh well, it's okay. Regardless, it's not a bad interior to be in, and a little bit sporty in keeping with the theme of the car. The car, of course, would get sportier a few model years later when the 1.8-liter overhead cam engine would become a 2-liter overhead cam engine, and the horsepower go from 150 to 165. It was a little pocket rocket and very light. These cars only weigh about 2,700 pounds, so 165 horsepower in a 2,700-pound car is really not bad at all. I would love to have one with the manual transmission as opposed to the 3-speed auto that I don't think would be nearly as fun. The unfortunate part really was that aside from the engine being cool, it did, of course, you're pressurizing the engine with the turbocharging. They did, of course, have some head gasket issues, as it seems most turbocharged engines did in the 1980s. So watch out for that. Make sure that you don't have any head gasket issues, and probably best not to really pound on these after all these years. But for something that's cool and fun and certainly a novelty, you can have one of these 2000 Sunbird Turbos. So what do you think? Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know. Thanks again for watching.